Well, days after number one LSU beat Alabama baseball in Baton Rouge on April 28, 2023, seemed like a pretty normal outcome. But days later, Ohio gambling regulators halted bets on games that the Crimson Tide was involved in. It raised a number of red flags at the time, and we've since learned that head coach Brad Bohannon had provided inside information about his lineup that led to a bettor attempting to place a $100,000 bet in Cincinnati. But you won't believe how investigators uncovered everything, but we're going to give you those details coming up.
This is Distant Replay.
Welcome into Distant Replay. We are glad to have you. Ben George with Mike Noto. We always go through sports history, true crime. Mike, this kind of fits the true crime narrative a little bit, but the most recent story we've covered, but it's a remarkable one because we just recently learned about the details involved, and it's pretty hard to believe.
It is bizarre. I mean, when we get into the details of this scandal, like you said, Ben, not what you think of when you think of crime, right? I don't know that there was any victims here per se. It's arguable, but just a bizarre situation.
Yeah, to hear kind of how this thing played out is, as Mike said, bizarre. But hit subscribe on YouTube if you're following. We appreciate the new people who've come in, the new subscribers. It really helps us out, continues to help us grow. We're going to try to keep pushing out new episodes every week. But, again, just hit subscribe, like the video as well. It helps us out a lot. So, Mike, I guess as we get into this, a little bit of background before we get into this story to kind of help people kind of get a better sense of where we are. So, sports betting first. Now, it's not uncommon we've seen sports betting scandals in this country for decades, right? As long as there's money involved, you're going to find somebody that's going to give up information or throw a game or whatever else. But I think the biggest news is things have been legalized here, and it's pretty new in terms of sports betting being legalized around the country. I think we're going on, 7 or 8 years? And that's really opened the door to the NCAA and college athletics trying to get their hands around this kind of new beast that's out there, because it's much harder to handle it when everybody can openly bet and everyone, even athletes, can go out and put bets on games, even though there's a lot of rules around it. It still opens up a huge Pandora's box.
Yeah, the pool of prospective bettors just widens. And what comes from that, Ben, and you see in this story, is people making classic, like naive, amateur betting mistakes, which was at the core of this issue.
That's the thing, right? A lot of these times these criminals make it easy for people. And that was no surprise here, which is what is going to be, I guess, a little maybe he'll catch you off guard, because you would think in a situation like this with the people involved, you would think they'd be a little more sophisticated, a little more buttoned up, but not the case. So as we get into this, let's give you a little background on Brad Bohannon, the Alabama head coach that was involved, who has now since been fired, and we'll go through some of the NCAA penalties that were handed down. But, Mike, you're talking about a guy here that took over an Alabama baseball program that kind of has a pretty good history. If you go back, there's been a lot of really good players. They were really good in the 90s and 2000s. Kind of started to tail off in the 2010s a little bit, had a little bit of success, but hadn't been to the College World Series in a long time. In comes in 2017 Greg Goff, a one-year guy, went 19-34-1. He was so bad, Mike, that they had to get rid of him after 1 year. There was a lot of stories about how he treated the players, wouldn't allow facial hair, had a lot of these just real strict rules about how he wanted everybody to behave and act and carry themselves. And the players, from all accounts, did not like him at all. So much so that a guy comes in, and the new AD at the time, Greg Byrne, decided, hey, I'm not even going to wait to see how this plays out in year 2. We're going to cut bait immediately. That's kind of where Alabama baseball is when Bohannon takes over.
Yeah, Bohannon, now you got his pedigree from what I read, Ben. He was an assistant in the SEC at Kentucky, one of these guys like a Wake Forest MBA, like a very educated guy, baseball guy, was in the SEC before taking over at Alabama. And you're right, he's tasked with sort of resurrecting a program that had been on hard times.
And you look back through his career and his path up to Alabama, he was a very highly respected assistant coach. He was a great recruiter. Some of the teams that he helped build at Kentucky and some of the players that he brought into Kentucky when Kentucky was good about 10 years ago or so, they had some really good teams, and he was a big part of bringing those key pieces in and discovering them and getting them to Kentucky and building that program. Went to Auburn, same thing as an assistant at Auburn for just a couple of years, but did get on the recruiting trail, find a couple guys, was doing his similar thing there at Auburn when Alabama said, hey, this is a guy that we want to bring in, has great recruiting connections, which is a big part of baseball, Mike, because you got to understand there's It's different from state to state depending on how many scholarships are available. Just under 12 total scholarships are available for college baseball, but some of these states have lotteries that are able to provide money for other athletes that are in state that can come there and play for free. So it's not a balanced playing field for a lot of these schools. So being a good recruiter and being able to find these top-end guys and get them into school and keep them out of the draft, which is another issue with college baseball, Major League Baseball, is tough. So you find a guy like Bohannon that can do this, and you kind of find right away that he's in a pretty good position. And I, at the time, Mike, was working and did a few of those games for the SEC Network, and he's speaking with him, great guy, forthcoming, easy to talk to, got along, would provide information, would sit down and talk with you and just talk baseball with you, right? He was a guy that was easy to speak with and just kind of glean information about what his team was doing, because most coaches are just coach speak and, will just kind of give you basic answers. But he was, he'd open up and just talk. And I'm not saying that in the sense of like he's going to share information like we'll get into a little bit later. I just mean in terms of just providing information for the people that were covering his sport to make their job easier. He was great at that.
Yeah, and that's a key part of this story because in everything I read, and you're giving a personal account of it, which is great, and everything I read, everyone, the story we're about to tell, everyone to a man was shocked that he was involved in it. So it wasn't something where there was things leading up to this behavior-wise that people weren't surprised he was involved in this. It's similar things to what you said. Great people person, great recruiter, loved the game, and the fact that he would risk all of that for what we're about to cover is again, mind-blowing.
All right, so let's jump into this. So, again, April 28th, 2023, just under a year ago from when we're recording this, Alabama was heading to Baton Rouge to play a series. Now, Alabama at the time came in kind of middle of the pack, got off to a good start on the year, was playing decent, but they came in 30-13 overall, good overall record, but just 9-10 in the SEC. Now, the SEC, again, maybe the top baseball conference, loaded top to bottom. It's tough. It's tough just to make the SEC tournament, which takes all but 2 teams, I think. So even getting into that is an accomplishment in a lot of cases. So that's kind of where Alabama is. A good team, but just kind of middling in the SEC, can't quite find its ground, have pulled off a couple of wins, and now they're heading to LSU and Baton Rouge. And, Mike, even kind of tapped into college baseball, but it doesn't take anybody that's a huge college baseball fan to realize that LSU and going down to Baton Rouge and playing in the box is one of the toughest places to play in the sport. Especially
last year, right? Mm-hmm. So we're talking about the LSU baseball team last year, from my memory, Ben, is one of the most hyped up college baseball teams I can remember. I mean, they were getting coverage during the regular season in college baseball, of course, led by who would become the number 1 pick in Paul Skeens, and that kid Cruz was the number 2 pick, wasn't he?
Yeah, they were loaded. I mean, it was sick. And Skeens, if you followed baseball at all, you knew who Skeens was and how good he was. And just knowing going in there that Alabama had their work cut out, period, to go in and pull out a win, especially on a Friday night, because Friday is when you front load your Friday starters. That's when the best pitchers are going out there. And Alabama was going to counter with Luke Holman, who was their best pitcher a year ago. He came in, he had a sub-4 ERA, was their best starter out of that rotation, and he was coming in and going to give Alabama a decent chance to start against them. So on the surface, this is a pretty clear Alabama's an underdog, going to try to battle it out in Baton Rouge, see if they can't pick up a win in this series against LSU and get out of there. So in this game, it comes to find out that Holman is a scratch, a late scratch. Alabama has to throw Hagen Banks instead, who hasn't pitched very much throughout the year, hadn't pitched, I think, in a few weeks before that. At that time, he's going up against Skeens. Now Alabama has this work cut out completely, and the game kind of plays out like you'd expect. And probably doesn't go a whole lot different than if Holman was on the mound, right? LSU gets off to a quick start. They kind of tack on some runs. They're carrying an 8-1 lead into the 8th inning. Alabama does rally in the 8th and 9th, scores 1 in the 8th, 4 in the 9th, Mike, and has 2 runners on before LSU holds on for an 8-6 lead. Alabama actually out-hits LSU in this game. But it's a pretty ho-hum score. If you're reading scores, you'd say 8-6, LSU wins. Not a big deal. It's kind of what we expect. All right, on to the next score, right? Nothing really to read about this game.
Yeah, little did you know that things going on earlier in the day in the state of Ohio in the coming days would become front and center sports news throughout the sports landscape.
So that's where things get interesting. So just within a couple of days, Ohio announces they're not taking any bets. They're going to halt betting on Alabama. And at the time, I don't know if you remember when this story first hit, Mike. Obviously, I did. It would showed up on all the feeds that I have, being an Alabama guy. I saw this story from firsthand, and it was kind of like, well, this is very odd. Why would, number one, Ohio be halting bets on Alabama? That seems kind of out of the ordinary. A state like that, what is their interest? And then I think another state maybe it popped up a time or two, and so you start kind of getting word, what's happening with Alabama, and I think word spread back that maybe it was something involved with Alabama baseball. But as soon as you hear that, you go, well, Alabama baseball lost 8-6 to LSU, nothing out of the ordinary at all with that game. Alabama battled. They scored a bunch of runs late. They almost came back and won. Like, what could possibly be the deal there, right? How could there be any kind of scandal in an outcome like that?
And what I remember from it, Ben, was first you got word that Ohio was going to take down all the Alabama baseball games. And then I think once the other big sportsbook operators got word on that, just as like for cautionary reasons, I remember in very short order, you not being able to bet on an Alabama baseball game anywhere. So this was something that, and again, with sports gambling becoming a lot more prevalent and with the power of social media, this story began to spread like wildfire, again, because at this point we didn't have many details on what was going down.
So then, Mike, it didn't take long either for Alabama to act, which is what really started to raise a lot of red flags and make people go, wait, what actually is going on here? Alabama actually fired Bohannon on May 4th. So the game was April 28th, and just by the next week, Bohannon was out of a job. So you're talking about a guy that's a promising head coach in a great situation, building his team in the SEC at a great school, now gone in a week, and that's when it's like, okay, how involved was he in what was actually happening here?
Yeah, and the what is actually happening and what happened and how it happened is the fascinating part of this story. And once he gets fired, now the reporters kick into reporter mode, right? And they want to find out everything about this situation and how cut and dry and how elementary and how unsophisticated this little gambling scheme was is really the shocking part of the story.
All right, so let's get into the story now then, Mike. The negotiated resolution from the NCAA was released on February 1st, 2024. And in it, it detailed the investigation and summarized what exactly they found. So let's get into it.
Yeah, so let me bring you back, Ben, to the day in question, okay? April 28th, 2023. It's earlier in the day in the state of Ohio, okay? The farthest thing from everyone's mind in the state of Ohio, or most people at least, is the Alabama-LSU SEC baseball matchup, A man named Bert Neff walks into the sportsbook at the Great American Ballpark in Cincinnati. It's an MGM-sponsored sportsbook at Great American Ballpark in Cincinnati. So we're not talking about him logging onto his phone to place a bet. Mm-hmm. We're talking about him walking into a brick-and-mortar sportsbook.
And right? I guess the idea being that you're going to be able to place a larger bet brick and mortar than you probably can online.
Correct. Yes, exactly. It's kind of like the old school, when you go to Las Vegas where you see the guy with a bunch of money place a bet at the window, Mm-hmm. That's what people have built up in their head that betting at a brick and mortar sports book is like, okay? But there's realities to this, Ben. Of course, as we know as gamblers, there's limits to how much you can bet on each sport.
Right.
It's based on the sports book. It's based on more so the event. So this guy, Bert Neff, walks into the MGM Sportsbook with $100,000. $100,000 and wants to place it on LSU money line versus Alabama that night in college baseball.
All right, so $100,000 is a huge bet in college baseball, especially now considering you're betting for a team halfway across the country. Now, it is the number one team in LSU, so not surprising there, and not surprising to place a money line bet on the top team in the country playing at home with their best starter in the country on the mound, right? So that in and of itself isn't the craziest thing you've ever heard, because that's not that uncommon. The size of the bet, yes, obviously, but what he's trying to bet, not that surprising.
Yeah. If you're going to bet a college baseball game, typically if you follow the total number of bets in a given night across the sports landscape, let's say college, the higher profile teams, whether for them or against them, the games involving those teams attract the most total bets. So again, not a shock if he's going to bet college baseball, he's going to bet LSU. But to think that you're going to be able to walk into this sports book and bet $100,000 on college baseball speaks to a very naive, very amateur, better, in my opinion, that to even think you could even do that. So that's the kind of level of scheme, quote unquote, that we're dealing with here.
Okay.
So he walks in, wants to place a $100,000 bet on LSU money line. Again, unheard of, immediately sets off red flags. In a very surprising move to me by the sportsbook, Ben, they tell him, we can't take a $100,000 bet because of our limits, but we can take a $15,000 bet on LSU. That, to me, Ben, is even very surprising.
Yeah, I agree too. That you would think the limit would be probably 5,000. I mean, you would think in this situation, but because of such a big money line bet, maybe it was okay. But yeah, it's still surprising in that regard as well.
So when he's informed about the betting limits and that they'll take the $15,000 bet, he's still trying to plead his case as to why he wants to bet the $100,000. And I kid you not, because this came out in the NCAA investigation, he is pleading his case to the sportsbook workers by saying things like, well, if you only knew what I knew about this game, you would want to put $100,000 on it too. Like insinuating that he has inside information of what the outcome is going to be based on, certain specifics that he knows about the game. That's crazier than thinking you could wager $100,000 on a college baseball game.
And not only that, Mike, that he said was this straightforward with the staff. Like that's going to be, to think that that's going to be the information that sways a sports book to allow you to place bets is that you have information that they don't have. If you think that's what's going to win them over, number two, that's like the fifth thing on this list of why this guy is crazy in this situation. But he actually showed the sports book staff messages as well from Bohannon. And not only that, he told him, these are from Bohannon, the head coach at Alabama, and he's telling me that his starter's not going to go. I got to get these bets in.
Yeah, people would later be quoted involved in a situation saying that he couldn't be more reckless. He had a messaging app, like you said, an encrypted messaging app with Bohannon on it, giving him vital inside information about the game that he wanted to place initially a $100,000 bet on and now a $15,000 bet on. It almost seems like, and I don't know why this would be the case, that he was trying to get caught. It's so reckless and so naive. I haven't heard anywhere that this was the case, but I can't blame anyone who would come to that conclusion based on the facts.
Now, let me also get into this a little bit more because there's like another level to this in my mind. What I thought was really crazy is they were using the Signal encrypted messaging app. This is, again, all out of the NCAA's findings that they just released here in the last few weeks. Have you ever used Signal, Mike?
I haven't, no.
Are you aware of Signal?
I'm aware of encrypted messaging apps, not Signal.
It's like a competitor to WhatsApp, and it's again supposed to be private. Nobody can access this. So I started doing like a little bit of digging around because they actually list Signal as where these messages were being sent between Bohannon and Neff, which is not surprising, right? They want to keep it private, encrypted. This is something that will blow up Bohannon's career if it gets found out. But what I think, because going through it, I don't think that an outside entity could come in and pull these messages because they disappear, they're gone. I could be wrong there. But from what I understand by this report is that they use surveillance cameras because he had his phone out reading the messages and showing the messages. They pulled the surveillance footage, were able to zoom in on his phone to see these messages and see who they were from. So without him doing that, if he just keeps his phone in his pocket, even if he says, I have information that you guys don't have that I need to place these bets, if he doesn't go as far as to pull out his phone and show them the information, the cameras don't pick it up and can't figure out who's on the other side of that message potentially. That's the way that I read this report. And to me, that's even crazier that that's the situation. That's the way they find out and tag this back to Bohannon potentially is through these surveillance cameras that are picking up an encrypted messaging app because he's showing it to him.
That's exactly how I read it too, Ben, is that the surveillance cameras picked up him. And he must have had Bohannon labeled as Brad Bohannon. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like
Alabama head coach.
There's even ways, Alabama baseball head coach, Brad Bohannon, like his official title, because like literally they had the surveillance of exactly what he was saying back and forth, exactly the inside information that he knew about the game, which is why he was placing the wager. And there's a lot of times in this story, Ben, including what we just outlined, where there could have been no ramifications for anyone because, listen to this, you have this information with Bohannon. If he didn't clearly take out his phone so it could be surveilled and label the guy as Brad Bohannon in his phone. Also, when he first gets questioned about, hey, why do you want to put a $100,000 bet on an Alabama LSU game? The first time he's questioned like that, if he just turns around and says never mind and walks out of the sports book, nothing ever happens.
Yeah.
When you walk into a sports book, it's not like when you bet on your phone. No one knows who you are.
Right.
So there was multiple chances for this to end differently, and just the hubris or the stupidity, depending on how you want to phrase it, by Neff, really, I mean, it cost Brad Bohannon cost himself his job, but this, even on top of it, was just a death knell for him.
Which is why it just, to me, it seems so stupid at a basic level, all the different ways that this could have been avoided and they could have gotten around this. And it's why, like, for Bohannon, I get you feel comfortable with the Signal app, think everything's private. You don't expect this guy to blow up your spot like that. But have they not talked through this? I mean, this, to me, Mike, does this reek of something that happened for the first time, or has this been happening multiple times with, I'll say with Neff first and with Neff and Bohannon? Because to me, it just seems like this has to be the first time the way this thing went completely off the rails.
This has to be the first time they're doing something like this, because it's just so, the stupidity is at such a high level that it seems like, when you try something for a first time and you don't know what you don't know. Mm-hmm. It seems like that was betting to these guys, or specifically to Neff. And, Ben, obviously the inside information that Neff had that he was placing the bet based on was the fact, like you mentioned before, that Alabama star pitcher Luke Holman was going to miss the game. So we're at a time period now when Neff is at the sports book. Bohannon has told Neff the information, but Bohannon has not told LSU yet. So the information is not public. So they even have text messages from Bohannon telling Neff, hey, look, Holman's not going to pitch. It's confirmed. I haven't told LSU yet. Place the bet so I can tell LSU. Like, basically telling Neff, hey, hurry up and place the bet, because I have reporting requirements that I need to adhere to be able to report him out for the game.
Yeah, because they have to obviously let the other coaching staff there exchange lineup cards and let other staff know who's going out to the mound. But it was great because they actually have the detailed text in this NCAA report. And Bohannon texted Neff, first word, hammer, all caps, Mike, hammer. The student athlete is out for sure. Let me know when I can tell LSU. He finished it with hurry. I love that this is like a text message I would send you if I thought I had some information on the game.
I was going to say the same thing.
Hammer this team, dude. This is a no-brainer.
Except we don't have inside information. We just think that
right.
Because we read an article or two that we know who's going to win the game. But yeah, it is like a text you would send your buddy. It's very amateur and very and not indicative of someone who should be betting $15,000 or $100,000 on anything.
No. It's pretty remarkable. The detailed report, I'll drop the link in the show notes so you can read it for yourself. It's not super long, but it gives some details. There's not a ton of details, though, Mike, which is, again, to your point, how they could have all gotten out of this if Neff just changes just a couple of actions here, because they didn't have a lot. They had a small window of time to focus on, and they had the camera footage from Neff to look at his phone. Otherwise, probably getting around this, and it is what it is. It's the number one team in the country, wins a game at home on a Friday night against an unranked team. Not a big deal. But it's really interesting kind of going in on, Neff and part of the problem here too, now the fallout from all this, following this. So like the whole story in itself is pretty crazy, but now you have all the fallout. The NCAA finally coming out with this. But Neff in of himself is an interesting character, Mike, because he's got kids at play. He's been a coach himself. Like how he's gotten into these circles is pretty interesting to try to track down.
Yeah, the little bit of research I did into Neff was obviously he's the guy you want to know the most about in this situation, because what happened to Bohannon is pretty cut and dry, right? Mm-hmm. He's fired by May 4th. Very quick investigation. He's fired. To bring us back a little bit, those bets were then flagged by MGM's wagering integrity firm called U.S. Integrity, who had immediately notified the Ohio Casino Control Commission. They also immediately notified the SEC, who was also a client of this U.S. Integrity, to report these issues. And that's how now the investigation gets underway. That's where we find out about Neff, all right? On that same day, Ben, that Neff is in Ohio trying to place this Alabama bet, there are also associates of Neff trying to place large wagers in Neff's home state of Indiana. Those wagers are also of the nature where they're flagged by the Indiana Gaming Commission. There's no specific details of what those bets were on. I couldn't find any details of what the bets placed in Indiana were on, but there is a lot of speculation because, like you said, Neff is a travel program baseball coach. All right, these are very popular programs. Think of it like AAU for basketball. Okay, he's a coach. He was involved with a program called the Indiana Elite. His son was a key player on those teams, a very good Division I level type player. His son, at the point of this incident last year, is playing at Cincinnati. So while we don't have details on what the bets were that were placed in Indiana, we know that Neff's son is a pitcher at the University of Cincinnati. And on May 17th, 2 Cincinnati staffers, a gentleman named Kyle Sprague and a gentleman named Andy Nagel, are both fired. There's not a lot of specifics on why they're fired, but people familiar with the situation say that they were aware of Neff's gambling activity and didn't report it. So that leads you to believe that they knew that Neff was gambling, maybe on Cincinnati games, maybe with information that they were feeding him, but that's all conjecture on my part. But that led to those 2 employees, again, coaches of his son, getting fired just 13 days after Bohannon gets fired.
Yeah, there's not as much information out there on that part and that connection itself, which I think maybe we'll know more as the trial unfolds a little bit, because Neff has since pled guilty to federal charges on this investigation. And that's the other part of this too, Mike, is since that time, these investigations have been happening in Alabama, and he's been getting involved and obstructing the case as well. So on top of everything he's done, not surprising is kind of this boneheaded move of going in and trying to get in touch with everybody that's involved in this and tell them to destroy evidence, get rid of your app, get rid of your phones, get rid of all this stuff, and like actually talking to them about, hey, what are you discussing in your trial? Like trying to get information from everybody that's involved, because according to the documents in this case, he shared the screenshots from that night with a few other gamblers. I think 4 gamblers wagered on the game outside of Neff as well. We don't know who they are. They're unidentified at this time. But he's been in communication with them over the last set of months, just trying to get information from them and figuring out what investigators are asking them, and then also getting them to delete evidence and trying to obstruct the case.
Yeah, and well, remember, Ben, we went into before how everyone was pretty shocked that Bohannon would be involved in something like this. I mean, even yourself, I think you yeah. I'm assuming that based on your interactions with him, you were even surprised. Well, it's the complete opposite with Neff. So you have to, everyone that was, in the reports that I saw that were interviewed about him, they were not surprised that he would get embroiled in something like this. So complete opposite, just like sort of seemed like a seedy character. Like he was the kind of kid who, great high school player, great prospect when he was coming out in the 90s, and everything that held him back had to deal with off the field issues. Cocky, arrogant kind of guy from all reports. And this is the guy now who becomes later in life, his son is also talented at baseball, becomes one of these travel baseball coaches who, again, they hold a lot of cards in terms of recruiting, right? So if you're a Brad Bohannon or any other college coach, it's in your best interest to get in good with the travel baseball coach, so then you have an in with a prospective athlete. So these guys build up in their head that it's about them, right? Mm-hmm. That they did something, when in actuality, the only reason why anyone wants anything to do with them is to recruit their players. So that's the kind of guy we're dealing with here.
Yeah. Pretty wild that he got involved. And it's really interesting to kind of know how he got connected to Bohannon, probably through recruiting circles, you think, but it's interesting to know how those two got connected and who else he's connected with, because it just seems if a guy like Bohannon can get involved, and again, I don't know Bohannon personally off the field, but from all accounts, a good guy, great family, just a pretty normal, salt of the earth kind of guy, it seems like, right? Good baseball coach, but to get involved in this, it makes you wonder who else and how many coaches are involved in something like this to some extent. Now, hopefully they got a partner that's not as reckless as Neff was, and so they're actually able to pull this off. But it's interesting that this is the case. And you wonder, like, what Bohannon's get out of it, because the guy had a really good salary. I don't know if many people know how much baseball coaches get paid.
It was reported that he had a salary of $500,000 at the University of Alabama last year when this incident happened. And I can tell you, Ben, I know you're a lot more familiar with this than I am because, you know, you're from down there and you're very, very plugged into the athletic culture down there. I had no idea that a college baseball coach in the SEC, even a head coach, got paid that much. And that makes this situation even more mind-blowing. It leads you to believe, although we have no details, there might have been other things that Neff was doing to burn his money where he saw this as a way to make money, because it's just like, at least that's sort of the natural conclusion you come to, because I had no idea that these coaches made that much money.
I had two theories. One that I just heard somebody else say that I don't think has any credence, but it's interesting and just made me think about it. In this NIL era, a school like Alabama and most schools don't have a ton of NIL money for baseball. And these coaches are facing an uphill battle in order to keep guys in school and to get kids down there. As I mentioned, the scholarships are a problem. I heard one person that is kind of tapped into college baseball in general just speculated, again, all speculation, just his theory on why someone might do this in that position was that he thought he might be trying to raise NIL money, just to try to generate additional money that he can use towards the program, which I think is a little bit far-fetched, but I could kind of see the argument for that in some places. But what I think might even be more so the case, because I don't know what does Bohannon get out of that, right? Sure, more money, but you have a nice, healthy salary to school where football is king, and you still have a spotlight on you, but you're still in the shadows of a giant. You just do a good job, and people will leave you alone. You're making a good salary. My only thought is, Mike, is do you think there's a possibility that he gets involved with somebody like that in recruiting circles to make them some money to help move recruits or to get some favor towards Alabama, or to maybe get on somebody's radar that he normally wouldn't have gotten on, potentially?
I would believe that more if this guy Neff was from like South Florida or Texas, or maybe even Alabama. But how much of a hotbed is Indiana high school baseball, in terms of recruiting kids to the SEC? I think that oftentimes in situations like these, Ben, the reason why someone gets involved is a lot more simple than the speculation, and it's probably something to do with that. It's just such a head scratcher that it's baffling.
Yeah. Well, the NCAA has resolved things. Again, they sent out their negotiated resolution on February 1st, 2024 between Alabama and the NCAA itself. And they, again, detailed a lot of the stuff we'll share in the show notes. You can read it for yourself. Very short read. Won't take a whole lot of time to get through there. But essentially, Bohannon obviously not going to have much of a future in baseball. He's 48 years old now. He now has a 15-year show cause. So in order for him to get back in, they'd have to make a big whatever school hires him would have to make a big case in front of the NCAA to bring him back in. So likely not the case for him to get back into the sport at 63 and start coaching. Now, maybe at a smaller school, a high school or something like that, I could see that being the case because he is still a good baseball coach. But essentially nothing's going to happen there. And Alabama basically skirted any kind of violations because this is kind of an incident that's so unique, and that by all accounts, the school had no idea on. The players didn't know anything about. This was a coach sending this message probably in his own office before a game, right, on his phone quickly, and no one had any idea, not even his assistant coaches, who still remain with the team even after he left. But he had that 15-year show cause, and then Alabama basically has to just do like gambling education with the student athletes. It's basically what it kind of boils down to. If they mess up again, they can obviously hit with bigger infractions, but basically they're just having to educate their kids on sports wagering and kind of how to monitor these things. So they get off of it without much of a penalty at all, but everything on Bohannon here. And then Neff, on the other side of things, now that he pled guilty, he's facing what could be a pretty big sentence, I think up to 10 years and a fine of $250,000 is potentially there. So we'll wait to see how that all plays out, Mike, but he seems to be in a pretty tough position, and who knows what other evidence they could find from him while the investigation goes on.
Yeah, he's going to get 10 years for basically thinking that you could bet $100,000 on a college baseball game.
Right.
Which is crazy. And what's important to mention also is just to reiterate what Ben said, there was no evidence that any other Alabama players, coaches, even Neff's son that we mentioned before, none of them are facing any kind of charges or any kind of allegations or anything. Mm-hmm. So this was completely a Bohannon Neff situation, and I'm sure they have other associates gambling wise that are involved as well that are being questioned behind the scenes by authorities. But yeah, no one else involved. It was these two from a public profile standpoint that were involved, and yeah, it's one of those things where you just hope you don't continue hearing incidents like this. I don't think it's college baseball is I think was viewed as a very pure sport before this happened, and to realize there's an underbelly even in college baseball, I know gave some of their fans pause, because that's the thing with college baseball, right? Everyone's always like, oh, look how much they love the game, sliding head first, they're out there for the love of the game, and it kind of maybe tarnished that a little bit in some people's eyes.
Yeah, no question. The other piece of this puzzle, the Alabama team that did remain, going through this in the middle of the season, can be pretty tumultuous, but Alabama would lose that series to LSU, no surprise. All three games were pretty close throughout, but they got swept in that series. And again, up until this point, Alabama had won just 2 of 6 SEC series. Lose this one, they were 2-5 in SEC series, but they went on to win the series against Vandy the next weekend, who was number 5 in the country. Again, right after he's fired, the May 4th, the day that Bohannon's fired, they beat Vanderbilt 11-2 at home. Okay, they win 2 out of 3 there. They win 2 out of 3 in Texas A&M, and then win sweep Ole Miss in Tuscaloosa to finish things off. Alabama ends up making a run in the SEC tournament, wins their regional, and goes and faces Wake Forest in the Super Regional. And again, remember, Wake, number 1 team in the country, dominant pitching staff. Alabama lost a 1-run game the first game and then got blown out game 2. But all told, one of Alabama's better seasons in general in terms of how far they went in the postseason in quite some time, which is pretty remarkable for what happened and what transpired through that year. But Alabama head coach Jason Jackson gets a lot of the praise for that, because of him able to pull that team together, lead them on throughout the rest of that year, and he did stay on staff when they brought in the new head coach as well this offseason, and good for him for doing that, because he had a big part of keeping everything together. And they closed out the year pretty well. Now Alabama this year is undefeated, Mike, to start the year, ranked in the top 20, and off to a good start. So pretty crazy to see how this played out, but you can kind of see what he built, and I think they're building on what Bohannon kind of put into place and a lot of the guys that he brought in, and they were heading the right direction, Mike. Who knows what Bohannon could have done had he had a little bit more success at Alabama, maybe made a run to the World Series, could have maybe even parlayed that into a bigger job or even more money. So he wasn't that far from having a pretty remarkable career potentially, but threw it all away for this one game against LSU and trying to give some information away to a better.
Yeah, and credit to the Alabama players. I think that's an important part of the story. I mean, to find out that your coach bet against you, right, which has to be demoralizing, I would imagine, or wanted to bet against you, and to rebound from that and end the season the way they did and start this season the way they are now is a credit to those kids. Yeah,
pretty crazy. But I guess, Mike, this won't be the last betting scandal that we'll talk about here on this show. I know there's a couple other on my radar, but I know there's going to be more that's going to happen, I'm sure, with the way that sports gambling is being so prevalent now across the board. We've already seen some things with Iowa State's student athletes getting involved before football season last year. A couple got kicked off the team. There's going to be more of this, I'm sure, to happen. But I don't know that any will be as stupid as this story ended up turning out to be, with the way that everybody got caught who was involved. So we had to bring it to the show here, and I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Distant Replay. Again, all we ask is that you hit subscribe on the podcast, on the show, wherever you listen, but especially on YouTube. Like the video. Leave us a comment as well. Tell us what you think, and let us know if there's anything you want us to cover as well. We appreciate it. I know we had one comment, Mike, for Cecil Collins to track him down and maybe do an episode on him, and had a couple games that have been thrown out our way too, which we'll try to go back and do. So we always appreciate that.
Absolutely. Those listener suggestions are what it's all about. And until next time.